The wind howled a dirge through the skeletal pines, a sound like the land itself weeping under an iron-gray sky. Snow didn't fall so much as hang in the air, a million frozen needles driven by the relentless gale. It coated everything in a bitter white shroud, the slumped roof of the derelict cabin, the splintered remains of a fence, the frozen, unforgiving earth. Inside the cabin, huddled beneath a single threadbare blanket that offered little defense against the invading cold, was the girl, Clara. Her name felt too soft, too fragile for this place, for this life she now clung to with desperate, bone-weary strength. She was small for her 10 years, thin as a starving animal, her skin stretched taut over sharp bones. Hunger gnawed a constant, hollow ache in her belly. The cold was a different beast, insidious, numbing, threatening to steal her awareness as it had stolen everything else. Her parents were gone. The fever had taken them, one after the other, quick and brutal, in the solitude of their ill-fated claim. She had buried them herself, scratching at the frozen ground with numb fingers and a broken shovel, a task that seemed impossible but somehow got done in the days of grief and necessity. Now the cabin was just a shell, a trap. The small store of food was gone. The fire had died days ago, leaving only a gray ash heap and the memory of warmth. Each breath was a shallow, painful gasp of frozen air. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was dulled now by exhaustion and the encroaching lethargy of hypothermia. She had prayed, whispered pleas to a silent sky, but no help had come. This, she thought with a detached clarity that was perhaps the mind's last defense, was how it ended. Quietly, alone. A sound broke the wind's monotony, a crunch of snow heavier than an animal. Panic, sharp and brief, pierced the numbness. She pressed herself further into the corner, eyes wide, tracking the sound as it grew nearer, then stopped just outside the listing door. A long silence. Then, a hesitant creak, the door groaning inward on rusted hinges. A large shape filled the doorway, silhouetted against the swirling snow. A man, bundled in thick, trail-worn furs and wool. He stood for a long moment, letting the brutal wind blast into the cabin, seeming unaffected by the cold that was killing her. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for, she didn't know what, cruelty? Indifference. When she opened them again, the man had stepped fully inside, pulling the door shut, plunging the cabin back into a deeper gloom broken only by the weak light filtering through cracks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a heavy beard and the shadow of his hat brim. He carried a rifle easily in one hand. He didn't speak. His eyes, when he finally looked directly at her huddled form, were unreadable dark pools in the dim light. She saw no pity there, but not immediate malice either. Just assessment. He looked around the cabin, taking in the emptiness, the dead fire, the small, trembling heap that was her. The silence stretched, thick with the cold, and her racing heart felt like a lifetime. Then, a single word, rough as bark, broke the quiet. Child, it wasn't a question. He took a step towards her, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen dirt floor. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she had nowhere to go, no strength left. She could only stare up at him, a small, vulnerable creature cornered by something vast and unknown. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady. "You alone?" he asked, his voice low, without inflection. Clara could only nod, a tiny movement of her chin. Another long pause. He looked from her to the dead fire, to the meager blanket. A flicker, was it reluctance? Weariness? Crossed his features. The storm outside raged, a constant reminder of the choice he faced. Burden himself with a dying child in this wilderness, or leave her to the inevitable. He made his decision. Turning, he walked to the fireplace, dropped his rifle, and began to methodically clear the ash. He didn't look at her again, but the small, purposeful sounds of his work filled the oppressive silence, pushing back, just slightly, the terrifying quiet of her solitude. The man worked silently, efficiently. He broke dead branches from inside the cabin walls, snapped them to size with surprising ease, and laid a careful fire. Soon, a tentative flame licked at the kindling, casting dancing shadows that chased away the deepest gloom and warmed the air with grudging slowness. He gave her a small piece of jerky and a mug of hot water, impossibly good after days of nothing. She ate and drank slowly, watching him constantly from beneath lowered eyelids. His name, he'd said once gruffly, was Silas. He didn't ask hers. He didn't ask how long she'd been alone, or where she'd come from, or about her parents. He asked nothing that required her to speak the pain aloud. He simply existed, a solid, quiet presence in the cabin, mending the roof as best he could against the wind, checking on the small fire, his movements deliberate and self-contained. Clara remained mostly silent, a small shadow in his periphery. Fear still lingered, a dull ache behind her ribs, but it was overlaid with a profound exhaustion and the simple, overwhelming relief of warmth and not hunger. She watched him, watched his hands, calloused and strong, tying knots, cleaning his rifle, preparing food. Watched his face in the firelight, lines etched deep by sun and wind and something else she couldn't name, loneliness. Perhaps hardship. His eyes were watchful, missing nothing, but they rarely rested on her for long. He didn't smile. He didn't offer comfort in words, but his actions were a quiet, steady assurance. The fire was kept going. There was always a little food, even if it was just dried beans or smoked meat. The wind might howl, but the roof no longer leaked snow directly onto her blanket. These were not gentle acts, not born of soft sentiment, but of a stark, practical competence that the wilderness demanded. She began to move more, tentative at first, then with a growing, quiet determination. She would fold the blanket carefully, brush the dirt floor with a makeshift broom of pine boughs. Small tasks, born of a desperate need to prove she wasn't a burden, a useless mouth to feed. Silas watched these efforts but said nothing. One afternoon, he was mending a tear in his coat. She had watched his big fingers fumble with the small needle. Without thinking, she picked up a piece of spare thread and a needle she'd found amongst her mother's meager belongings and, moving slowly so as not to startle him, began to mend a loose seam on her own dress. He paused, looked at her for a long moment, then went back to his own work. A silent acknowledgement. Slowly, imperceptibly, the dynamic shifted. She wasn't just a survivor he'd found. She was a presence in his solitary life. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious trust built not on words, but on the consistent, reliable reality of food, warmth, and his quiet vigilance. She learned the rhythm of his days, checking traps, hauling wood, maintaining his rifle. He learned, what did he learn about her? Her quietness, perhaps, her resilience, the way she watched him with intelligent, if still wary, eyes. He started leaving her simple tasks, sorting beans, stirring the stew, keeping an eye on the drying meat. These weren't chores. They felt like shared duties, small acknowledgments of her place, however temporary. The cabin, bleak as it was, became less a trap and more a shelter. It wasn't home, not like the one she'd lost, but it was safety. And Silas, this silent, gruff man, wasn't just her rescuer. He was becoming something else, a silent guardian in a world that had proven brutally indifferent. The slow burn of trust was a fragile flame in the harsh wind, but it was lit. Time blurred into a rhythm of survival, days marked by the light and the demands of the wilderness. Clara grew stronger, her cheeks losing some of their gauntness. Her silence remained, a deep-seated habit, but her eyes were less shadowed, more alert. Silas, for his part, seemed unchanged on the surface, still solitary, still speaking little. Yet small things shifted. He taught her to tie useful knots, the kind that held snares taut or secured packs. He showed her how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to read the signs the forest left behind. These were not lessons in childhood play. They were lessons in staying alive. She absorbed them with a quiet intensity, understanding instinctively their importance. He taught her how to aim his rifle, letting her feel its weight, though he never let her fire it. "Know the tool," was all he said. Her presence seemed to make him see things differently, too. Or perhaps, having someone else to consider, he spoke aloud observations he'd previously kept to himself. "Wind's shiftin'," he'd murmur, pointing to the way the snow swirled around a particular ridge. "Means trouble brewin'," or "tracks here, not deer. Heavy boots." Not mine. Attention began to enter the quiet routine. They were not the only ones in this corner of the world. The vast, empty landscape suddenly felt smaller, potentially more dangerous. Silas grew more watchful, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon, his hand often resting near his rifle. He reinforced the cabin door, checked his meager traps closer to their immediate area. He showed Clara where he had extra supplies, just in case, he'd explained, his eyes meeting hers for a rare, direct moment. "You gotta know." That just in case hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Clara felt the shift too. The fear returned, a colder, sharper edge to the worry, but it was different this time. It wasn't just for herself. It was for Silas too. He was her protector, but he was also just one man against the unknown threats the world held. Her internal monologue, once filled with despair and cold, now held a quiet determination. She would not be a burden. She would use what he taught her. She watched him, learned his routines, the subtle cues he gave when he sensed danger. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with shared vigilance, a wordless pact of mutual reliance. He was the shield, she was the silent observer, the one who noticed the small things he might miss while focusing on the large. One bitter afternoon, the just-in-case arrived. 3 men, as rough and unforgiving as the landscape itself, rode into the small clearing around the cabin. They looked like claim jumpers or worse, desperate men, their faces hard with cold and avarice. Silas stepped out, rifle in hand, standing between them and the cabin. Clara stayed inside, hidden just behind the doorframe, peering through a crack, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She heard the men's voices, harsh, demanding. They wanted the cabin, wanted whatever Silas might have found. Silas's answers were short, firm denials. The air crackled with tension, thin ice over a deep, cold current of violence. She gripped the small, sharp knife Silas had given her, not for fighting, but for cutting cord, a tool he'd taught her to use precisely. The argument escalated, voices rising above the wind. One of the men dismounted, starting towards Silas. This was it. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, remembering Silas's lessons. Where was the small pile of dry tinder he kept by the hearth? Where was the opening in the back wall he'd shown her, hidden by brush, just in case? While the men's attention was fixed on Silas, Clara slipped through the hidden opening, out into the brutal cold. She moved low, using the terrain Silas had taught her to read, circling around towards the edge of the clearing. Her small size was a gift here, letting her move unseen. She reached the rocky outcrop Silas had pointed out days ago, the one overlooking the clearing. Scrabbling up it, she reached the small cache he'd shown her, not food, but a pile of dry wood and oilcloth. With trembling fingers, she used the flint and steel he'd given her for fire starting, shielding the spark from the wind, coaxing a small flame into life. She built the fire quickly, as Silas had taught her, not a large, roaring blaze, but a small, hot, smoky one, exactly on the point of the ridge he'd indicated. The wind caught the smoke, whipping it away from the cabin, sending a dark plume scudding across the white landscape, away from the men below. It was a signal, one Silas had taught her was used by trappers in this area, a warning of danger, or a call for distant help, depending on its placement. It was a long shot, hoping someone might see it, but it was something. And the process of doing it, the focus required, stilled the frantic fear inside her. She was acting, using what she knew. Below, the confrontation reached its peak. As the dismounted man lunged towards Silas, he stumbled, his boot catching in a loop of thin cord hidden just beneath the snow. A snare loop, set with the knot Silas had taught her, refined by her own small, nimble fingers after he'd shown her the basic principle. It wasn't meant to hold a man, but it was enough to trip him, throw him off balance. Silas reacted instantly, a flash of movement, his rifle butt connecting with the man's jaw. The other two hesitated, startled by their companion's sudden, clumsy fall, perhaps glancing towards the ridge where the peculiar dark smoke was now visible against the white sky. A moment of confusion, a break in their aggression. Silas didn't press the advantage. He simply stood his ground, rifle ready, a silent, formidable shape. The air was thick with unspoken threats, but the moment had passed. The men, unnerved by the unexpected resistance and perhaps the signal smoke, exchanged glances. They hauled their groaning companion onto his horse. Without another word, they turned and rode back the way they came, swallowed by the swirling snow. Silence returned, broken only by the wind. Clara scrambled back down from the ridge, her legs shaking. She slipped back into the cabin the way she'd left, finding Silas standing by the door, watching the empty clearing. He turned as she closed the hidden panel. His eyes, usually unreadable, held a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Surprise? Acknowledgement? He saw the smudge of soot on her cheek, the frantic rise and fall of her chest. He didn't ask where she'd gone, or what she'd done. He didn't need to. The tripped man, the signal smoke, he knew she had played a part. Not with brute force, but with quiet knowledge, with the skills he had given her, used in ways he hadn't explicitly directed, but had enabled. In the quiet aftermath, the shared look was everything. Her presence hadn't just been something he'd tolerated. It had been, in ways neither of them could fully articulate, essential. Her quiet resilience, her watchful eyes, her willingness to learn and act when needed, had changed the outcome. The men who rode away likely saw Silas as simply a tough old hermit who got lucky or was more prepared than he looked. They didn't see the small girl who, with fire and knot, had tipped the scales. Silas perhaps saw it more clearly. He saw the strength forged in her by hardship, the quiet determination that mirrored, and perhaps rekindled, his own. She had come to him a fragile waif, needing rescue. She had become a partner in survival, her subtle actions a powerful force in their small, brutal world. The harsh landscape remained, the wind still bit cold, but the cabin felt different. It was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was a place they had defended, together. Clara looked at Silas, and saw not just the gruff protector, but the man who had chosen not to leave her to die, who had shared his hard-won knowledge, who had, through his quiet presence, allowed her own resilience to blossom. And Silas looked at Clara, this small, brave creature, and the vast, empty space inside him felt a little less desolate. She had changed his life, fundamentally, irrevocably, not by being saved, but by simply being, by surviving, by showing him a reflection of the quiet strength he thought he'd lost. They faced the future, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people bound by the shared crucible of the wilderness, their survival a testament to unexpected connection and the quiet power of a resilient spirit. The world outside might never know her name or understand her impact, but in this small, remote cabin, her life, and his, had been undeniably, profoundly changed.